it is time for a catch-up wrap-up. I have not wrapped up any of the books I've read since June, and that ended up being 41 books. 41 books. No one wants to sit through me talking about 41 books, let alone me wanting to film that. So instead of that, I am breaking this up into 4 different videos based on the genres. So I'll be doing SFF, romance, contemporary and nonfiction, and childhood rereads. This first one is obviously the SFF, though when I say SFF, I really mean mainly fantasy and one science fiction, but it's fine, it's still SFF. Also, one little note, I will be talking about books in a series together rather than purely chronologically because it just makes more sense to talk about the same series at the same time rather than jumping back and forth multiple times. So the first book I read was The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This is the second book in the Poppy War series, which is a Chinese-inspired fantasy story. A lot of it is really based in Chinese history and a lot of it is based on the Opium Wars. So this book really doesn't shy away from violence. It doesn't glorify war the way that some fantasies do, and it shows you the nitty-gritty of exactly what happens, and because of that, it can be a very challenging read. The first book is about Rin, who is an orphan who's trying to escape her abusive foster family, and to do this, she studies to get into the best military school in the country. However, when she gets there, halfway through her studies, the country actually goes to war and she learns what the truth of war really is versus her studies in class. As far as the second book goes, while it's not as physically violent as the first one was, it is psychologically violent. It is still just as dark. It just goes into slightly different things. There's a lot of addiction and dealing with addictions and withdrawals from addictions, as well as colonialism and racism, while still being set on this backdrop of war. So you have everything kind of mixed together and it is intense. I really enjoyed getting to learn more about this world. A lot of it gets expanded. You start meeting new people and seeing their perspective on events that happened. You also get more insight into the history of the country and how things kind of came to be. You still don't have all the answers, which just makes the last book all the more enticing because I want to know what happens, but you're given enough of the world and the history to be satisfied in this book. However, I did have some issues with it. I started to notice the writing more, which I've heard people complain about with the first book, where the writing is kind of clunky and there are actually some sentences that are just grammatically not correct. I also noticed, because I was listening to it as an audiobook, that all of the dialogue basically just ends with he said, she said. And when you're listening to an audiobook where a conversation is happening and it's line after line of blah, 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 he said, blah, 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 she said, blah, 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 he said, it becomes very, very obvious. I also felt like I couldn't really connect to the characters as much. I don't know why that is. I'm not really sure what changed, but I just wasn't feeling as strongly for them as I remember doing in the Poppy War. It might just be the descent into madness that our main character is going through that's making it harder for me as a reader to connect to her and to accept her actions. But at the same time, I remember loving her enough to want her to do right even if she's doing the wrong things. I want to shake her and get her to wake up. But I didn't really feel that as much in this book. Also, everything related to the sort of romance in this was not really my cup of tea. It's not a huge part of the story at all. I mean, there's wars and people dying. You don't have time for romance. But all the little bits that do come up were probably realistic, but still just not really something that I needed as part of the story. Overall, I enjoyed the book, not as much as the Poppy War, which was one of my favorites of last year, and I'm not sure quite why that is. I think a lot of this book is set up for the finale, which makes sense. And I did really enjoy learning more about this world, but it just wasn't quite there for me. I'm obviously still super excited for the final book in the series. It's coming out November 17th, and I've heard nothing but good things from everyone who's gotten ARCs. Even though I am still terrified of going into it, all of these books I've just been so scared to start just because of all of the violence that people have said are in it. And after reading the first book and seeing exactly what they were talking about, I was not any less scared to start the second book. And that's going to transfer into the third book, I'm sure. I will be reading it soon as my library gets a copy of it, which I don't know why they don't have yet. But I put in a request for it, so hopefully they'll be getting that soon. But as soon as they get it, and as soon as I get over my fear, I will be reading it. I read 3 books in the Discworld series, which were Men-at-Arms, Soul Music, and The Troll Bridge. The Troll Bridge is actually a short story. The other 2 are books. Men-at-Arms is part of the Night Watch series, and it follows the usual rambunctious group of city guards as they try and find out who has stolen this very dangerous artifact from one of the guilds. I really loved this book. It was probably the best Discworld I've read so far in my read-through, which was very surprising considering I haven't really particularly liked the City Watch books before. They were fine, but they weren't my favorites. But something about this book just like went to the next level for me. I feel like the plot was actually really gripping. This sort of mystery plotline of who stole this artifact, where is it, why did they do this, was actually really fascinating, and I wanted to know. I was completely sucked into it, which doesn't normally happen with mystery for me. I'm not really a mystery reader, and I don't really read police procedurals either, and that's kind of what this is, although with a Terry Pratchett spin because absurdist fantasy, of course. So I was really surprised by this. In addition, I feel like the character work in this one was much better done. The characters all felt much more 3D, much more complex. You could see them growing and changing and learning, which I absolutely love. That's my favorite part of reading, so seeing that in these books was fantastic. All of the Discworld books beforehand didn't really feel like they had as many character arcs or character development in them, or even just like a well-developed plot line. Most of the stories were driven by just this ridiculous plot that he kind of went anywhere he wanted with it, which is fine, it's fun, but this one actually felt like it had more substance, and I really enjoyed it. I think part of that was also because there were real stakes in this one and people dying, which doesn't always work in Discworld because it's so humorous, but in this one you could feel the humor, of course, but also this like darker undertone that worked really well. As usual, Terry Pratchett has some social commentary in his books. In this one, it was minority representation, which was very interesting to read in the current climate. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. It was a lot of fun while also giving me exactly what I want in a story. The next book, I was not so fortunate, however. Soul Music, I did not like at all. This one is about rock music taking the Discworld by storm, kind of literally, because it's basically an infectious earworm that turns you into a rock and roll zombie. I just thought this one was boring. I didn't really care about the plot of this rock and roll music taking everyone over. I didn't care about the characters at all. They're not really anyone that you've seen before other than a few characters like the wizards from the university and Cut Me Own Throat Dibbler. So you don't really have a connection to them before this book, and I found that I couldn't really connect to them during this book either. I think part of this book is also built on references to the 60s and rock and roll culture, and I'm just not versed enough in that to understand the references or get any enjoyment from them. And I seriously had to push myself to actually finish this book, which, I mean, normally Discworld, I can just get through it and have fun with it, and it's fine even if it's not the best. This one I just really didn't like. So that was a bit unfortunate, but The Troll Bridge, the short story, was actually pretty good. It's one of the best short stories that I've read from the Discworld so far. Most of them don't really have like too much substance. I mean, they're like a page long. How much substance can they really have? But this one was actually pretty interesting. It had an actual plot line, it had characters, and again, a little bit of character development, which was really interesting to see. It follows Cohen the Barbarian as he goes to try and defeat a troll, but the troll ends up being like one of his biggest fans, and it's really funny. It's a really interesting interaction, and I think it actually leads into some of the later books in the series. If I'm not mistaken, I will double check once I read those books, but I really liked it. Out of all of the short stories, I think this is one that would be the most fun and most beneficial to read. Next, I read The Magnolia Sword by Sherry Thomas, and this is a Mulan retelling that I had so much fun with. It has the same sort of basic storyline of Mulan having to go to war in her father's place and dress as a boy, but in this one, there's also this additional family rivalry and a yearly duel to battle for some legendary swords. I had to get my tea. I am not used to talking this much. It has been ages since I've filmed. So while Shang isn't the love interest in this, there is still a love interest, and it was really adorable. I really love them as a couple and their interactions. While I can't say they're my favorite couple of all time, they were just so sweet together, and I just really liked it. The atmosphere in this is perfect for ancient China. It's exactly what you're looking for when you look for a Mulan retelling. The author is Chinese, and I can tell that they did a lot of research into this sort of time period where Mulan was supposed to have lived, and it shows through the writing, and I was actually able to learn a little bit. I loved all of the interactions with Mulan and her squad, her little group of friends around here. They were perfect. And there was character development, there was tension, there was action, there's literally everything you could look for is in this book. There was a little bit of a weird thing with the climax at the end where it cut the tension kind of really abruptly, but other than that, everything else was great, and I really enjoyed this book. It's nothing very revolutionary, it is a basic Mulan retelling, but I just really liked it a lot. I had so much fun reading it. And I think the character work and the character interactions were done really well. Next, I read City of Brass and Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty, and I loved it so much. These are the first two books in the Daevabad trilogy, which is about Nari, who is a con artist living in Egypt, when she accidentally summons a Jinn warrior and gets whisked away to the magical city of the Jinn called Daevabad. When she gets there, kind of all shit breaks loose because of who she is and her companion who comes with her, and it's fantastic. I did do a reading vlog when I was reading the City of Brass, so if you want to see my thoughts in real time and me getting tongue-tied over all of the insanity that is in this book, you can check that. But I really loved these books. The world is incredible. It is so lush, and everything is laced with magic and atmosphere that really transports you somewhere else. The characters are so easy to love and yet so flawed. They've made many mistakes and they've done many things that are not great, and yet you can't help but love them anyway. They're just written so well, and everything is layered. Nothing is straightforward, especially with the plot. There's a lot of political maneuvering, political intrigue in this. There's a lot of different people who are trying to get in power, people who are just trying to survive, and everyone is scheming and going behind each other's backs and planning things for decades. It's intense, and there are a lot of twists and turns, and everything is dangerous, and I was kept on the edge of my seat the whole time. There are so many questions I had after the end of this book. It was insane. I was freaking out. The world is so huge. There are other magical creatures beside the Jinn, and you don't know how everything ties together. You don't know how all of these different creatures interact, and it's just fascinating. So I basically immediately picked up Kingdom of Copper, which is the second book in the series, and in this one everything is expanded. You learn more about the world, you learn more about the lore and the history, and yet not quite enough, so it's just so tantalizing and you want to learn more. There's even more political scheming, if that's even possible considering the first book. There's just so much going on all the time, and you still love these characters, even though I wanted to throw the Katani brothers in a lake and make them learn to live with each other because, oh my god, they need to get their shit together. But like I was saying with Rin in the Dragon Republic, that's a really good sign if you care about them enough that you want to smack them upside the head. Again, the atmosphere was just palpable. It's written so well, it completely transports you, and I forgot that I was reading a story when I was in these books. I was just that engrossed. I think my only complaints about these books are there is some slightly odd pacing in parts where it'll slow down and then speed up kind of randomly, and I don't care for any of the romance that's in this series. Again, it's not a huge part of the story considering everything else that's happening in the world, just like the Poppy War. No one has time for a little romance. But other than that, I just really love these books. I love how they make me feel. The atmosphere is just perfection. I have just started Empire of Gold, so I will be finishing out this series very, very soon, and I'm so excited. And yet also kind of terrified for what's going to happen. I think most of the best fantasy books do that to you, honestly. Unfortunately, the next book I read, I DNF'd, and that was Empress of All Seasons by Emiko Guin. This is a Japanese-inspired fantasy following a yokai girl as she's trying to prove her worth to her clan by winning this competition to be the Empress. The Emperor is putting on this competition to find a bride for his son, but the prince really doesn't want to marry some random warrior girl who wins this competition. I really love the world in this book and learning a lot more about the yokai, the Japanese demons, because that's something that I am very interested in and I don't have much background in, but that's really the only thing I liked about this book. I just didn't care for anything else. I couldn't connect to the characters, and I think that's mainly because the writing is a lot of telling rather than showing. You get explained like how these characters feel versus seeing their thought processes and actually interpreting how they're feeling, which just keeps you a little bit distant from the characters and makes it harder to connect to them. And the plot was just really, really slowly moving. I got a decent way into this book and yet nothing had really happened. And one other thing with the writing is the author kept trying to weave in a bunch of Japanese words, and normally I'm all here for that. I love the culture that you get when you start mixing in foreign words into your books, but in this one it was really clunky. There were just so many Japanese words that it just became really overwhelming. And the words weren't really that important. They were kind of minor things like chopsticks. And right after she said the word in Japanese, she would explain it and translate it in English. And after seeing multiple of these different words on a single page, it gets really kind of annoying, because then it turns into more of a textbook list trying to teach you vocab rather than adding anything really meaningful to the story. So I just decided this book wasn't really worth my time. I wasn't getting anything out of it, so I DNF'd it. Next, I read The Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan. This is the third book in the Wheel of Time series, which is a huge classic fantasy series. It follows the chosen one who is a farm boy who learns that he means so much more to the world than he thought, and all of the other classic fantasy tropes. Good versus evil, kings, queens, knights, magic. Pretty much anything you can think of in a classic fantasy is in these books. Now, I've had a really up and down experience with this series. I really didn't like the first book. I loved the second book, and the third book I didn't like again. I feel like it was just so meandering and I don't really see the point of it. The plot kind of felt weirdly structured. It felt like it wasn't going anywhere, and things were skipped over that I feel like shouldn't be skipped over, and things that we could have skipped over were spent a lot of time on, and nothing really felt like it was leading to anything. It kind of felt aimless, and while there was a little bit of character development, I think it wasn't enough to make up for this really weird lack of plot. Though Nynaeve and Guin, similar to the Katani brothers, needed to be thrown into a lake and learn to live with each other, though I didn't care about them nearly as much as I did with the Katani brothers, so that kind of shows the little disconnect I had with these characters and with the story as a whole. And I also started to notice the repetitive writing that most people have complaints about with Robert Jordan, where he'll just repeat the exact same phrase over and over and over again. It became much more obvious in this, though I remember picking up on it in the first book too. Honestly, I can't think of anything that I really liked from this book, whether it was learning more about the world or any events that happened, any characters. I'm drawing a blank, so this was kind of a fail of a book for me. I'm obviously still going to continue in the series. I want to know why so many people love it, why it's a classic, but so far it's been really hit and miss for some reason. Next, I read Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi, which is an Asian fantasy novella, and I really enjoyed this. This follows a monk who is cataloging the items in a house that the late Empress used to inhabit, and they're talking to the servant woman who lives there and getting stories from her about all of these different items and about the Empress herself. This was slightly confusing in the best possible way. It was written beautifully and so lushly. I could picture perfectly in my head this house on the lake surrounded by these trees and greenery. It was beautiful. And the character of the Empress was fascinating. It's obviously a secondhand account of her, so you don't know quite how much of it is truth or exactly what she was thinking, but the picture that it painted was so interesting. I would describe this book as a lot of politicking in ancient Asia with some magic. This novella was really captivating, and I will be continuing in the series once the next ones are out. Speaking of series continuations, I read the third book in the Earthsea cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin, which was The Farthest Shore. This follows a prince as he goes to the sorcerers to report that his land is losing its magic. From there, he gets whisked on a journey with Ged, the main character from the first book, as they try and figure out what's happening to the magic in the land and why it's disappearing, why all of the wizards are suddenly not able to perform magic. This is a classic, straightforward journey adventure story. There are ship voyages and dragons and traveling to the land of the dead. It's exactly what you look for in that sort of classic fantasy story. And there were a lot of themes about life and death and eternal life and whether you should want eternal life or not, or what you're willing to give for eternal life. And it was really entertaining. I've enjoyed all of these Earthsea books for what they are. They're written in an older fantasy kind of story style where it feels more like a bedtime story that you would be told, and they're actually pretty short, so I wouldn't be surprised if people have used them for bedtime stories. I did have a tiny issue with some character motivations that weren't quite believable, but I could also see exactly what she was going for because she was going for a very particular kind of moral. So I just let that pass and continued enjoying the story. These are fun and sweet while also having some deeper meanings and deeper morals, and I would highly recommend them. On to the one sci-fi that I read. It was the next book in the Wayfarer series, which I now know is not a trilogy. There is a fourth book coming out next year. Besides the point, I read Record of a Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers, obviously, and this one follows a group of humans on a spaceship, just basically seeing their lives, seeing how a tragedy has affected them, and there's no real other plot besides that. It is a Becky Chambers book, it is a Wayfarer's book, there's not really much of a plot ever, and most of these characters don't really interact until the end of the book, which for me, it made it feel a little bit disjointed. They are all living on the same spaceship, so they are kind of related, but at the same time, they're very, very separate, and I just had trouble caring about any of them. I didn't really like this book very much. I couldn't connect to the characters, and there being no real plot, I couldn't connect to that either. And yet somehow I still cried, because that's what Becky Chambers does. She makes me cry, even when I don't really care. I don't know how she does it, that's just masterful, but other than that, I just didn't really care for the story. I found myself having to push through it because I just wasn't really interested. Similar to Wheel of Time, I've had a very up and down relationship with the series where the first book was okay. I loved the second book a lot. I think I gave it 5 stars. And then the third book, I just didn't care for again. I'm wondering if space opera just isn't my thing. I don't think I'm a sci-fi person in general. I've tried, and in theory, space opera would be exactly what I go for because I'm more into characters and kind of a slice of life story. And yet, when I've read these, I just haven't cared. And I don't know why. To be fair, I don't really think I've tried any other space operas, so maybe I should do that. If you have recommendations that you think I would like, please let me know because I am struggling with this genre. I think the only sci-fi that I found that I like was a thriller sci-fi, The 6 Weeks by Mur Lafferty, where it was a murder mystery in space. That was really fun, but other than that, I just not feeling it. I don't know why. And the last book I read was Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. This follows an albino Nigerian girl as she learns that she is one of the leopard people and she can do magic. I'm very confused about this book. A lot of it doesn't make sense to me. I really, really love the world. I love the Nigerian culture and the Nigerian inspiration for this magic system. That was fascinating. I know nothing about Nigerian culture and I loved learning more through this book. Although, in that case, I started wondering if it was actually like a real life part of the culture or if it was just the magic in the book. I don't know. I'm gonna have to do more research on that to figure out what was real and what was not. But I found that fascinating and I loved it. But everything else, not so much. I feel like I have this problem quite often. That happened with Empress of All Seasons, that happened with the Sixth World series, Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse, where I loved that Native American world and how the magic is involved in that sort of folklore mythology, but everything else I just don't like. The plot and the characters, I didn't like. In this book, it doesn't really have a plot until the second half of the story, because the first half, she's just discovering that she can do magic and learning about this world, which is fine. I really enjoyed that. And then the second half, we got this really random plot about them sending like 12 and 13-year-olds to go take care of a serial killer who kills children. Why? I didn't get it. Even if they have magic to protect them, the main characters just learned that she can do magic. What the heck is she gonna do? That was really weird. I was not a fan of that. And in addition, I just really didn't like the characters very much. For one thing, they acted older than they were. They're supposed to be like 12, 13, 14, and they definitely talked and acted and thought like they were like 16, 17, 18, which is a pretty minor thing in most cases, but it's slightly jarring when there are certain mature things that were brought up that just did not fit with the sort of middle grade YA style that this book is. And just with the characterization, all of these characters have very distinct personalities in theory. You're told about all of these different character traits that should be able to distinguish them between the characters, but when they're talking, I kept getting them confused. I didn't know who was talking. I couldn't tell based on their voice. I had to keep going back and checking who was actually talking because I was getting really confused, which is not a good sign, and I've known that to happen in other books before where I just get all of these characters confused because they all sound the same. I found there were some things that happened in the plot or some things that they were told that should have been major things and they had no repercussions at all, which was, again, very weird. A lot of this plot is just very conflicting, and I also had some issues with some thematic things where abuse was being shown as love, and while that may be true in some cultures where parents will abuse their children because they love them, it's not great to read about without it being challenged, because I honestly don't think that children should be abused by their parents out of love. That's just my opinion, but again, it could be a culture thing, similar to the other issue I had where there were a lot of gender stereotypes that were being perpetrated, again, without being challenged. Again, it could be a culture thing, but it rubbed me the wrong way, and I just didn't enjoy reading it. So I have very mixed feelings about this book. I didn't enjoy most of it, but I loved the world. I need more books that actually live up to their worlds. We get a lot of really fascinating worlds with Native American mythology and Nigerian mythology, and yet every other part of the story just doesn't live up to it, and it makes me so sad because there's so much potential for something really amazing, and I just don't end up loving it as much as I want to. I really, really want to love them. Please give me more recommendations for diverse fantasy, because even though I feel like I've been trying more diverse fantasy recently, I haven't been enjoying them. I just want to love things. That's the bottom line. So those are all of the SFF books I read in the last 3 months, basically my summer wrap up. It was very up and down now that I look at all of it together like this, which is kind of sad, but I'm sure Empire of Gold is going to bring it right back up for me. I have no doubts. I will be back tomorrow to wrap up all of the fantasy books I read in the last 3 months. So keep an eye out for that, because I had some really fantastic books in there too. But that's it for now, and I will see you later. Bye.